Thank you, Mayor Mitchum, members of the council. Todd Messenger, Fairfield and Woods, 1801 California Street, Suite 2600, Denver. We are presenting a 15-page final report tonight. We've provided a couple of copies. Each of you has one. Attached to that report is 5 pages or so of survey results. I'm not going to go through the entire report. I'm going to summarize that quickly. I think mainly what people are interested in is beyond the folks that came to offer comments and their input during the sourcing for the preliminary report, what does the larger landscape look like? And so we're going to spend some time on those topics tonight. And as a result of that survey data, we've refined and revised our recommendations to include recommendations that we don't think are going to be necessarily loved by all, but they are what we consider to be sort of the consensus positions as much as we can find it. We do realize that there are passionate voices on all sides of these issues, and that some of those passionate voices may not want to reach a middle ground. But we think that we provided as much of a middle ground as we're going to be able to find based on all of the input and the data that we've been able to analyze. I think it was a great effort on behalf of the mayor and the staff to send out hundreds of surveys to every resident and property owner in town. The response rate was more than 20%, which is pretty good, I think, for a mail survey in 2025. And so with that, I'm going to put this back and we'll start on our presentation.
Turn your mic up just a little bit. Can everybody hear him in the room?
As is traditionally a hallmark of one of my presentations, there will be gratuitous animation and slide changes that are totally unnecessary. That's just to make sure that everybody stays awake. So with that, I had a clicker, but it doesn't work anymore. So we're going to rely on teamwork to make this go. Okay, so the scope of this final report, as we were commissioned to do, addresses only the R2 district. And from here, we'll show that R2 district with some gratuitous animation. This is a little bit difficult to see in the gallery, but everything that's the light yellow is the R2 zoning district. So if you give one little click, we'll see a line trace that out. So this is the area that we're dealing with, is predominantly the single family and duplex areas of the town. Go ahead. Development in the C1 zoning district, and give me another click here, is outside of the scope of this report. But we think ultimately significant intensification along 44th Avenue is probably a good idea for the town's economic sustainability and quality of life. Substantial increases in intensity along 44th we think are not inconsistent with the recommendations, nor was that inconsistent with the preliminary recommendations. And as you'll see, they're probably even more compatible today. So a little bit of background, and all of you are familiar with all of this stuff. If there's a consensus that we skip the background, we can do that. Otherwise, we can do this for the record. The Mountain View is a 12 square block community incorporated in 1904, 121 years ago. Adopted its home rule charter in 1972, the same year yours truly appeared. The original plat has 48 lots per block, 24 on the east and 24 on the west, with 16-foot wide alleys, which gives us regularly shaped and traditional block patterns. The typical lots are 25 feet wide by 125 feet deep, but lots have been consolidated over time in groups of 2 and 3 normally. So most of the time now we have 50 by 125 or 75 by 125 lots. So these are generously deep 6,250 square foot or 9,375 square foot lots. They can support a lot of infrastructure. Almost all the lots have an east-west orientation on a north-south street. There are a few lots that were replatted over time on the southern sides of some of these blocks that have a north-south orientation. There are 220 lots in the R2 zoning district, and among them, 32 were built before 1920, 77 were built between 1900 and 1928, 29 were built during the Great Depression, 13 during World War II, 57 in the post-war era, which ended in about 1980, 1 in the 1990s, and then 11 since 2013. So we can see this trajectory where the development fell off for a while, and then it started to pick up with redevelopment in the 2000s and really after 2010. New construction and expansion here in the 21st century has been different from past eras in terms of scale and architecture. We can see on the left-hand side some of the newer things, on the right-hand side some of the more traditional formats. Design standards were adopted in 2001 and updated again in 2019 to deal with new construction coming into the environment of older homes. In 2025, the town retained us to analyze the current code, previous public discussions, and the comprehensive plan to understand the competing interests in town and the issues at play, and then provide a summary of those issues, which we did in the preliminary report. Tend to hold some public meetings where counselors and members of the public can comment on the issue summary and the proposed solutions. We did that as well. We had people looking at sort of visual preferences, if you will, and we took some of that data down. And we really ground through all that. We produced an inventory, which is in your record, but I didn't bring a copy tonight, of every house. My colleague Jackson Opnorth went around every house and took a picture, and then we kind of categorized where that house was. Then I looked at all of the assessor data for every house in town, looked at where it was in terms of assessed land value, assessed property value, and building improvement value, and so forth. We were asked to consider including a survey, which we did, to narrow down on the issues and solutions. We produced a survey. Mayor Mitchum helped us shorten that up and make it a suitable instrument, given what it had to do. And then we provided tonight a detailed summary of proposed code changes that address the issues. Now, the detailed summary is not actual code changes at this point, because we think we need to get direction from council in order to produce actual code. But I think we're specific enough in our recommendations tonight to give you a good sense of what that might look like. Mountain View, as you all well know, is a strategic, highly desirable location in the Denver metro region. It took me about 12 minutes to get here from downtown Denver. That's pretty good in traffic. So in a highest and best use scenario, the values of buildings will be substantially higher than the value of the underlying land. So if you have very expensive dirt, you have very, very expensive houses. Usually at least 3 times the value of the underlying dirt upon initial certificate of occupancy. So a typical property valuation in Northwest Arvada's Five Parks neighborhood, which isn't too far from here, is about 70% or more value to the building, and then 30% or less to the underlying land. Those are expensive houses, they're expensive lots, but most of the assessment is given to the building. And that means that that building doesn't need much. You can move right into it. You don't need to do much. Maybe you'll paint the walls or replace the carpet, but major overhauls and renovations and expansions or scraping and redeveloping the lot isn't an economically rational choice. The house is in really good shape. It's almost new. And that's why it assesses that way. As the value of existing buildings decreases, though, the redevelopment pressure increases. So when we start to see land values that are higher than building values, at some point, it may make sense to scrape off that building and then build something that's worth 3 times the land again. So you have 70% of the, well, roughly 3 times, you have 70% of the value back into the building. And when you get to a point where the demolition cost is justified by the new investment, it's not surprising that things get scraped off. Now, when we look back at the history of development in Mountain View, we can see that most of the homes are more than 50 years old, and they're modest in size on big lots in an area where development pressures are high. So it's not surprising the market pressures that we have. Next. So more than 94% of the lots in R2 were improved more than 50 years ago. Several areas, there were several eras in Mountain View's history where reinvestment in homes was not very common. Some of the homes started to fall apart. Some of the homes have weeds in their yards, trash, and other things. Some of the homes are in relatively poor condition with asbestos, lead, structural issues, other conditions that can make upgrades difficult. So then when the property owner is faced with a choice, do I renovate or do I scrape and redevelop? That comes into it too. So the demolition costs are higher, the remediation costs are higher, but the cost of going in there and remediating and then restructuring the inside or remodeling the inside is even worse. Sometimes it's easier to just haul everything away. About 82% of the 220 lots in the R2 district are ripe or almost ripe for redevelopment. 102 of them have land values that are 50% or more of the total value. That's a lot. 79 have land values that are 40 to 50% of total value, which means they're on their way towards that redevelopment if they're not already there. I mean, somebody's economic decision may be, I do it now, I can make it work now. It really depends a lot on the redevelopment costs that are involved. Next slide. So currently the town, so moving from sort of the current conditions to what is the town doing now, I'm going to very quickly summarize what the town's current zoning regulations do. I don't want to go through every last provision. The report actually does go through all the things that matter in terms of things that we're talking about. But right now, in terms of building size, which seems to be the biggest issue that we were asked to confront, on a 50 by 125-foot lot, which is two of the standard town lots, 2,500 square feet are available for a first floor. So a two-story building would be about 5,000 square feet. A 2.5-story building, I think you can build 75% of the floor below. So you're pushing over 6,000 square feet on a 2,500. I'm sorry, on a 5,000 square foot, not on a 5,000 square foot, on a 50 by 125. On a 75 by 125, you can do a lot more, 3,750 square feet on the first floor. So then you get to 7,500 square feet, and then you're pushing probably closer to 9,000 square feet or more when you get a 2.5-story building on a lot like that. So those are big homes. Go back one. Did I miss something? Yeah, so that's the half story is allowed. We don't know what a half story is, but a half story is allowed. We do know that it can't occupy more than 75% of the floors below, but we don't know how half stories apply like on a flat roof building, because typically an architect would think of a half story as under a sloped roof form where the walls are not terribly visible from the outside and usually have a dormer. So you have a bunch of 1.5-story buildings in town with traditional styles. Okay. So landscaping, we don't spend a ton of time on landscaping, and we didn't spend any time on landscaping in the survey, but just to know, like, you can tell the difference. If you have street trees, it makes a big difference in terms of hiding building mass, in terms of quality of life, in terms of creating outside enclosures. You have a great street tree program now. Our recommendation is keep doing that. And landscaping is an important aspect of your community character. So your current code requires a tree in the front yard or a street tree lawn and 30% permeable landscaped area on the lot. Probably you should consider continuing to do that. Okay, so you notice that flash transition? That means we're in the good stuff. So if everybody's awake, okay. So there were 330 surveys, which accounts for each lot, and then owner who may be off-site or in another town, and then residents. And I know we have some multifamily, so we got, I guess, surveys out to every single person. 71 of those were returned, so the response rate is 21.5%. Those were delivered to our office in their original envelopes, just a big stack of envelopes. So we went through and we verified the count. We looked at the envelopes. Most of the envelopes were in great shape. Some of the envelopes were a little tore up like you'd expect from the post office. Nothing untoward as far as we could tell. I think 4 of the surveys were copies, which was it 4? Yeah, it was 4 surveys. Somebody had lost it and asked for another copy. When we looked at those, we included them because number 1, they didn't change the result. And number 2, there was no appearance that they were copies by the same owner with the same information in them. So we had pretty good confidence that it was worthwhile to include those 4. The survey had 1, who are you? Are you a resident, a property owner, or both? Question, and 13 multiple choice questions about development and Mountain View. And it provided space for comments, and we got comments. The comments are summarized in the survey results, which is the 8.5 by 11 with the staples. We did not edit the comments. We'll just leave it at that. So next. The first answer, 54.9% of those who responded were both a property owner and a resident. When we're talking about these percentages, this is the percent of total surveys returned. Not everybody answered every question on every survey. So no answer is an answer in our view, and that brings us to 100%. If you see something here that says no answer or doesn't have no answer, it's because there were 0 no answers, but I think I might have written that on all of these. Bottom line is 50, when I say the percentage, it's of those who of total surveys. So here, 2.8% didn't answer, 54.9% were both property owner and resident. I have a strong suspicion that the property owner in Mountain View question was answered as, I'm a property owner, I can move on. And probably a lot of those actually live here too, but I don't know that for sure. Okay, next one. Should the town limit the size of new or expanded homes beyond the current rules? 50.7% of those who responded said no. So that was, I think, different from the sort of energy that we had in the room when we came out. But I think there were a lot of people that didn't come out that then responded in a different way in this survey. 39.4% said yes, 7% were not sure, and 2.8% didn't answer. In response to the question, do you think that the current size rules are too strict? 35.2% said yes, 32.4% said not strict enough. 22.5% said about right. So while too strict was the plurality, the majority of this, if you will, you can see that there's a balance there that is very close. Two were not sure, two didn't answer. Next question. Current maximum home height is 2.5 stories or 34 feet. Do you think that's too tall? About right. Too short? 43.7% at about right. Smaller variation around that, the too tall and the too short. 28.2% at too tall and 26.8% at too short. 5 people didn't answer this question, which was surprising to me, and 1 was not sure. But about right, I think, is where we land there as the equilibrium point on that question. Should pitched roofs be allowed to be a little taller than flat roofs? Overwhelmingly, yes, 71.8%. There was nobody that didn't answer that question. 6 people weren't sure, but I think we're pretty confident that pitched roofs should be favored in terms of architecture. And given that half stories are typically located under pitched roofs anyway, our recommendations reflect that in allowing that half story above the second story on a pitched roof building. We don't think you should be thinking about half stories because it doesn't actually function architecturally on a flat roof building. So we recommend bringing those heights down. The other piece of that, which isn't said in the presentation in the report, that a blocky flat roof building that's 34 feet tall is going to be more likely to impact sunlight than something that has a slanted roof where the slant goes down to the north side. So just some thinking. I'm not sure how half stories were implemented before. Maybe it was just if you had 75% of the second or the above the second floor, that was considered a half story, whether it was architecturally a half story or not. I don't know. We just recommend defining it. If there's some additional pressure to say you can build a third story that is 75% of the floor area of the second story, that would be a different consideration. Right now, as it were, the language prompted us to go down that other road. Do you think maximum home, I'm sorry, should pitch roofs, 71.8, we can move to the next one, sorry. Should zoning rules protect backyard privacy, for example, by limiting second floor window placement? 50.7% of respondents said yes. 5 people were not sure, 29 said no, and 1 person didn't answer. So I think 50.7 is actually a majority of those who responded to the survey instrument. So privacy, we heard that over and over again as something that people valued. And it looks like people value privacy in their backyard more than their individual right to put windows on the sides of their buildings. Should zoning rules help protect sunlight in backyards? Again, 63.4% here said yes. So regardless of building height, if we can do design controls that help with sunlight in the backyard, that's something that we should be considering, and you'll see that in our recommendations. Next slide. To protect sunlight in backyards, should the home be allowed to be closer to the street? 49.3% said yes. 10 people weren't really sure. We tried to provide some diagrams in our preliminary report about how that could work. And so that's kind of what we're thinking. Perhaps we need to illustrate that a little bit better, but the idea being if the big massing part of the building is closer to the street, then as the sun travels across the sky, you will have more opportunities in the afternoon and right before afternoon to have to have sunlight in the backyard of the next door building on the north side in the wintertime particularly. And in terms of limiting the maximum size of a home based on the side of the lot it's built on, 56.3% said yes. So even though the responses were that, the town shouldn't be more restrictive, the town regulations, it looks like people say should be tied to the size of the lot. So that suggests to us a floor area ratio, which is actually kind of more helpful in terms of if you're going to build a 2-story building, it's going to have a smaller footprint. If you're going to build a 1-story building, you could have a larger footprint. And I think that maybe takes care of some of the massing issues that occur. So no said 26. 3 people were not sure. And I think actually FAR is a pretty complicated question, but I think it was informative. Should the town limit the maximum size of a home? Oh, this is where we just were, sorry. Should more than 1 home be allowed on a lot if there's enough parking and the total size is within the same limits as a single home? So for example, if you're allowed to have 6,000 square feet of floor area, you could have 3 homes at 2,000 apiece. Yes, overwhelmingly, 77.5% of the people said yes. We would like to see multiple units on a lot. Maybe that's accessory dwelling units, maybe that's duplexes, maybe that's a bunch of little cottages, whatever it might be. If there's room and you can park it, you can do it. That also, by the way, that last question provides the opportunity then to leave an old house in place and build new houses around it, which is an interesting way of sort of preserving the history, but allowing for new economic use of the property. There was a question, we thought we would have had a different response to this in terms of the numbers, but we originally believed there was no appetite for architectural controls. Should new homes be required to generally match the look and feel of Mountain View's older homes? 25 people or 35.2% said yes, 52.1% said no. Seven people and 9.9% were not sure, and 2 people didn't answer. We got the sense that there was no appetite at all. There's a little bit of appetite, but it's not enough to make us suggest that you actually do it. Should homes that are close to the street be required to have a covered front porch? Again, to that point where there didn't appear to be any appetite to control architecture, 70.4% people said no. Should the town allow a flexible review process for buildings that don't meet every rule but still fit the neighborhood? So instead of having a variance which is based on hardship, since all the lots are essentially the same, it's very hard to prove an actual hardship when you're doing something that doesn't comply with the regulations, particularly when you're scraping something off and redeveloping it. But if you had to look at it in context and say, is this going to work anyway? A process like that wouldn't require you to make demonstrations and sort of pass it along with a wink and a nod. There's overwhelming support for this at 74.6% of respondents. So in terms of priorities, these are not surprising. Homes that create privacy issues and homes that block sunlight, you recall those were majority views, I think, or high plurality views that we should regulate for those things. And so those seem to be the priorities that most people indicated. Now, to be fair, I just want to, in the interest of full disclosure, we asked people to pick 2. I think there were 2 or 3 respondents that picked more than 2, and we just counted those because it wasn't enough to worry about it. So, remember that when you're answering a survey, try to pick 2. Sometimes the person reviewing the survey won't be that generous. They'll just throw your results out. We did not throw those results out. What's interesting here is that there were 31% of respondents didn't answer any of those, which suggests that what they're really saying is we don't think any of those should be priorities. And I think it's fair to say that many of those that didn't answer any of them, if they offered comments, those comments were, don't tell me what I can do with my property, or something along the lines of, I should have the freedom to build whatever I want. Some of them were a little bit more restrained than that, but these are not priorities for them. We saw kind of on both sides. We don't want big buildings. We don't want to be told what to do. We were not surprised by that result. Okay, so that's the survey results. Does anybody have any questions about survey results? Okay. What does that mean for recommendations? The preliminary report had a number of recommendations that were, I think, not necessarily in line with the survey results, but I think they were in line with the public participation we had to date. So at this point, we have walked back some of the recommendations, deleted some, taken some of the suggestions out, and then taken other suggestions and turned them into recommendations. So the first thing is we didn't originally recommend a floor area ratio standard. Now we think of floor area ratio standard as the way to handle building bulk height. Floor area ratio is a good way to do it. We don't think that lot cover is good because lot cover requirements really encourage maximizing the height. Whereas floor area ratio says you get a certain amount of floor area, you build it the way you think you want it. And we can make the floor area ratios high, but so that it's not real invasive in terms of what people want. But it does give them the opportunity. You can build more on one story if you want to be one story, or you can build less cover and higher if you want to do it that way. And particularly if you want to build it towards the front of the lot and protect your neighbor's sunlight, even better. We recommend defining half story, including the allowed amount of side building wall visible above the second floor. So basically what that means is, a lot of half stories, I'm standing on the floor, the outside wall comes up to here, and then the roof system starts to come in, and then you'll have a dormer. And in the middle of that space is where you have the sort of the headroom to move around, and usually we put storage under the other angles. So the amount of wall above the floor is important in terms of what the half story means for building height. Anywhere between 2 and 5, 6 feet is a good measure. Different jurisdictions use different measures. We've discussed that in our preliminary and final reports. Change how height is measured to encourage sloped roof systems. If we measure to the midpoint of a sloped roof, then we're not penalizing somebody for having a steep slope on their roof. If we don't measure that way, then we are taking away floor area when we do that. And if we measure flat roof systems, we measure the top of the parapet, which sort of discourages flat. I'm not saying flat is bad. I'm saying that in terms of the way the building formats, we just don't want them to be super tall so that their peak is at the same peak as a sloped roof building, if that makes sense. Reduce the maximum height for buildings with flat roof systems is the corollary of that. And that's because they can't by definition include half stories and because there's a community value to preserve sunlight on the adjacent properties to the north. The next recommendation is to divide lots into 3 areas for the purpose of bulk and height restrictions in order to preserve the sunlight in the backyard. So this, you increase the north side setback, you decrease the south side setback, and you decrease the front setback. And as you can see, these lots are actually angled so that they face a street on the upper right-hand corner. And then the areas, and this is 3 lots, the middle one is undeveloped. And so you can see how we've drawn the lines there, and you can see how dividing the building mass to the front of the lot on the winter solstice allows for sunlight to reach the middle of the lot on the lot to the north. So north is up to the upper left and east is the street, if that makes sense. And you can also see how changing the side setback in the first 2 graphics there makes a big difference in terms of where the shadow goes. And in your current code, you have a cumulative side setback. So you can have a short one on one side and a bigger one on the other, and you can sort of move around. But as we move the house to the north, we increase the shade impact on the property on the north side when the sun is in the south sky in the winter. So you're about actually to experience this, coming up here in the next couple of months. The next recommendation is to repeal the current bulk plan regulations and then recalibrate those side setbacks based on that prior slide so that homes sit closer to the southern side lot lines. Now, keep in mind, obviously, that none of this matters for existing houses. Existing houses are going to be what they are. You can't make people just pick up and move their house just because you change your code. It's only when people want to do something. And in terms of non-conforming buildings, you can't make it worse. So you can still build onto your non-conforming building and do whatever you're going to do. Consistent with the code, but you don't have to tear down a building just because it's non-conforming and you want to expand it. Reduce the front setback from 20 feet to 10, and as you saw on that solar access in the prior slide, that will not only provide that additional solar access, it may have some benefits in terms of street enclosure, that feeling that the street is a room where you can be comfortable and walk around. Allow development of multiple homes on a single lot, provided that the total development complies with the floor area ratio, height, and setback restrictions, and there's enough room for parking all those units. Next, allow duplexes in the same manner as single unit homes. The town's done that in the past. We don't see any reason to say you can build 3 or 4 units that are detached from each other, but you can't build duplexes. That doesn't make sense to us. A duplex works just as well. We know we can get them parked. We know we can make them look nice. So we recommend just letting duplexes happen. Subject to the same FAR